My mother and I were close until I discovered her secret. Now I don't know what to believe. Hey Reddit, my name's Mia, I'm 24, and I thought I knew everything about my mom, Claire, who's 50. She's been my rock, my best friend, and my inspiration for as long as I can remember. I've always admired her for being a single mom who sacrificed everything for me. But recently, I discovered something that's turned my entire world upside down. I found out she's been hiding a secret, one that changes everything I thought I knew about our family. I'm still trying to process it all, and I don't know how to confront her. Here's the story of how I found out and what's been happening since. Growing up, it was always just me and my mom. I have this vivid memory of being around 6 years old, running into the kitchen while she was making pancakes for breakfast. I was wearing my favorite pink pajamas with little rainbows on them, and she had flour all over her apron. She laughed as I zoomed around her legs, talking a mile a minute about the cartoon I just watched. She always made time for me, no matter how busy or tired she was. Mom worked long shifts as a nurse, sometimes double shifts at the hospital, but she never let me feel like I was a burden. She was a single mom who never complained about how hard it was, at least not in front of me. From a young age, I knew things were tight financially, but I never felt deprived. She always found a way to make life fun, like turning a night with boxed mac and cheese into a fancy dinner party, complete with candlelight and paper crowns. I always admired how strong she was, raising me on her own without any help from my father, whoever he was. The few times I asked about him, she'd shrug and say, "It's better this way," or "Some people aren't meant to be parents, and that's okay." Her tone always made it clear that the conversation was closed, and even as a child, I learned not to push. After all, I didn't feel like I was missing out. Mom was everything to me, and I couldn't imagine life without her. As I grew older, we became even closer. In high school, while my friends were butting heads with their parents, I was having movie nights with Mom. We'd binge watch everything from Gilmore Girls to Grey's Anatomy, and I joked that we were like Rory and Lorelai, with our inside jokes and late-night heart-to-hearts. I'd tell her about my crushes, my dreams of traveling the world, and my plans for college. She always listened, offering advice when I needed it but never pushing too hard. After high school, I went off to college, and while it was strange being away from home, I felt like Mom and I stayed just as close. We'd talk almost every day, and whenever I visited, it was like no time had passed. She'd welcome me home with open arms, a warm meal, and endless stories about the hospital or the neighbors. Everything felt stable, secure. But lately, since I've been back home after graduation, I've started to notice things, small, subtle things, that don't quite fit. I didn't want to believe that my mom, the person I trusted most in the world, could be hiding something from me. But the more I think about it, the more I can't shake the feeling that there's a part of her life I never knew. It began with tiny, almost insignificant moments. The first one happened on a lazy Sunday afternoon. We were sitting in the living room, flipping through old family albums. I loved looking at those pictures, it was like a glimpse into my childhood through her eyes. Mom would point out photos and tell me stories about each one, how I used to dance around in the yard in my princess dress or how I once insisted on wearing my Halloween costume in the middle of July. But then I came across a photo from when I was about 8 years old. It was my birthday party. I recognized the backyard, the table full of presents, and the cake with blue icing. But there was something that stuck out to me. In the background, there was a man standing next to my mom. His hand rested casually on her shoulder, and he was smiling at the camera. I didn't recognize him. "Who's that?" I asked, holding up the photo. Mom's reaction was strange. For a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Was it surprise? Worry? I couldn't quite place it. But then she smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Oh, that's just an old friend. He wasn't around for long." I nodded, feeling a little odd about her response. The way she quickly brushed off the subject didn't sit right with me, but I didn't want to push her. It wasn't the first time she'd been vague about something from the past, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People come and go, right? Still, I couldn't get that picture out of my mind. Who was he? Why didn't I remember him? And why did Mom seem so quick to dismiss the question? Then there was the day I mentioned a memory from when I was 6. We were having dinner, and I was telling her about how much I loved going to the park as a kid. I reminded her of this one specific day when she'd packed a picnic, and we spent hours at the park. I remembered her wearing a red dress, and how she had laughed as I ran around in circles, trying to catch butterflies. Mom looked at me strangely. I never owned a red dress, sweetie. Are you sure that was me? I frowned. Of course, it was you. I remember it clearly. But she just shook her head, smiling gently. You must be mixing me up with someone else. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. How could she not remember that day? It was such a vivid memory for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Memory is tricky, right? People forget things. It didn't mean anything. But the small inconsistencies kept piling up. The vague responses to questions, the moments of hesitation when I asked about our past, it all felt like little puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. The more I thought about it, the more I started to wonder if there was something she wasn't telling me. Something bigger than just forgotten memories. My curiosity quickly turned into an obsession. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was missing something important. Every conversation with Mom felt like it had an underlying tension now, even if we were just talking about the weather or what to cook for dinner. I started paying closer attention to her reactions, noticing the way she would sometimes get quiet or distant when certain topics came up, especially anything related to my childhood. One night, after Mom had gone to bed, I found myself staring at the box of old journals she kept in her closet. She had always been an avid writer, filling up journals with her thoughts, hopes, and stories from her life. When I was younger, she used to encourage me to keep a diary too, though I was never as diligent about it as she was. I sat there, staring at the box, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt guilty for even considering it, but a part of me knew that if there were any answers to the questions swirling around in my mind, they would be in those journals. With shaky hands, I pulled out one of the older ones, dated from around the time I was 8, the year of the photo with the man I didn't recognize. I flipped through the pages, skimming over entries about her work at the hospital, our day-to-day life, and her thoughts on raising me as a single mom. It all seemed normal, just the musings of a tired but loving parent. But then I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was an entry dated a few months before my 8th birthday. I saw him again today. After all these years, he just showed up out of the blue. I don't know what to think. I've been keeping this secret for so long, and now that he's back, I'm scared of what it could mean for Mia. She deserves the truth, but I don't know if I can tell her. I can't lose her. My hands started trembling as I read those words. I flipped back a few more pages, desperate for more context, but the entries around it were back to normal, everyday thoughts about her work and my school life. There was no mention of who he was or what secret she had been keeping. I felt like I was drowning in questions. Who was this man? Was he my father? Why had Mom never told me about him? And what was the secret she was so afraid of me finding out? I spent the rest of the night staring at the journal, my mind racing. It felt like my entire life had been turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my mom, suddenly felt like a lie. I didn't know how to process it. The next morning, I couldn't look at Mom the same way. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and reading the newspaper, like it was any other day. But to me, everything had changed. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to confront her, no matter how scared I was of what I might find out. That night, I decided I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. The tension in the house had become unbearable, and every time I looked at my mom, I felt a mixture of love and betrayal. I couldn't stand it. We were watching TV, some cooking competition show we both loved. Normally, we'd be making jokes about the contestants or picking our favorites, but tonight, I could barely focus on what was happening on the screen. My heart was pounding, my palms sweaty. I knew I had to say something, but I didn't know where to begin. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling. She turned to me, sensing the seriousness in my tone. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "I found something. In your journals. Her face changed instantly. It was as if I'd pulled the ground out from beneath her. Her eyes widened, and her hand tightened around the arm of the couch. What do you mean? She asked slowly. I found an entry, I continued, my voice shaking. From when I was 8. You mentioned someone, him. You said he showed up out of the blue and that you were keeping a secret from me. Mom stared at me, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, and the silence between us was suffocating. Is he my father? I finally asked, my voice breaking. Is that why you've been keeping this from me? You've been hiding him? Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it, that she'd make up some excuse. But then, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Mia, she said, her voice trembling. He's your father. My heart sank. I had suspected it, but hearing the confirmation made everything feel more real, more painful. I felt like the foundation of my life had just crumbled beneath me. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked, tears filling my eyes. Why did you keep this from me all these years? I was trying to protect you, she said, her voice cracking. Your father, he's not who you think he is. He's not the kind of man I ever wanted you to know. What do you mean? I demanded. Who is he? What's so bad that you had to lie to me about him? She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. His name is Richard, she began, her voice shaky. And when we met, I thought he was everything I wanted. He was charming, funny, and for a while, I thought we'd have a life together. But after I got pregnant with you, everything changed. I listened, my heart pounding, as she continued to tell me the story of my father, how he became controlling, how he didn't want her to leave him, and how his behavior grew darker over time. But that wasn't all. There was something even more terrifying beneath the surface. He was involved with dangerous people, Mia, she said quietly. People who did terrible things. I didn't know at first, but by the time I realized what he was into, I knew I had to get away. I didn't want that life for you. I didn't want you to grow up around that. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about a man who walked out on us. This was about something much darker. The word dangerous echoed in my mind. Dangerous? I had spent years wondering about my father, imagining him as someone who just couldn't handle the responsibility of a family. But now, my mom was telling me that he wasn't just absent, he was someone to be feared. What do you mean by dangerous? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom looked at me with a sadness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Richard was involved in some things, illegal things. He was part of a group that did terrible things, Mia. I don't want to go into the details, but he wasn't a good man. When I found out, I knew I had to leave. I had to keep you safe. I stared at her, my mind spinning. This wasn't the story I had expected to hear. It wasn't just about a man who didn't want to be a father, it was about a man who was dangerous, someone my mother had been running from for years. But he came back, I said, my voice shaking. You said in your journal that he came back when I was 8. What happened? Mom sighed, running her hands through her hair. He showed up out of nowhere, saying he wanted to be part of your life. I told him to leave, that he had no right to come back after all those years. I thought he'd go away, but I think he's been watching us ever since. A cold chill ran down my spine. Watching us? My father had been lurking in the background of my life, watching me grow up without me even knowing it? I've seen him a few times, she admitted, her voice barely audible. He never approached me directly after that day, but I'd catch glimpses of him around town. I always worried he'd come back and try to take you away from me. I felt like the room was closing in around me. This was too much to process. My father wasn't just some absent man, he was a ghost, haunting the edges of my life without me even knowing it. And now, it felt like he was closer than ever. The revelation of who my father was, and the fact that he had been watching us all these years, left me reeling. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts and fears I couldn't shake. Had he been there at every important moment in my life? Had he watched me graduate from high school, walk across that stage with pride? Had he been at my college graduation, lurking in the shadows while I celebrated with Mom? The thought made me feel violated, like my life hadn't truly been my own. I spent the next few days in a fog, barely able to concentrate on anything. I avoided Mom as much as I could, not because I was angry with her, but because I didn't know how to face her. Every time I looked at her, I saw the years of secrets she had kept from me. I understood why she had done it. She was trying to protect me, but it didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. One night, a few days after our conversation, I found myself back in front of the box of journals. I didn't want to read more, but I felt like I had to. There was a part of me that needed to know everything, no matter how painful it was. I pulled out another journal, one from a few years later, and began flipping through the pages. Most of it was normal entries about my school life, about her work at the hospital. But then I found another entry about Richard. I saw him again today. He was standing across the street, watching Mia as she walked home from school. I don't know what he wants, but I'm terrified. I keep hoping he'll go away, but he never does. I feel like we're trapped. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. This man, my father, had been stalking us for years. How had I never noticed? How had I gone through my entire life without realizing that there was someone watching from the shadows? I couldn't keep this inside any longer. I had to do something. I had to confront him. A week passed after my discovery in the journal, and I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. My father. The man who had been lurking in the background of my life, haunting my mother with his presence. I knew I had to confront him, to get answers to the questions that had been plaguing me ever since I found out the truth. I didn't tell Mom about my plan. I knew she'd try to stop me, and I didn't want to put her through that. She had spent years protecting me, but now I needed to face this on my own. I needed to understand who my father was, and why he had stayed away all these years. It took me a few days of searching, but I eventually found a contact number for him. It wasn't easy. He had no online presence, no social media accounts. It was as if he had tried to erase himself from the world. But I found him, and I dialed the number with shaky hands, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone rang a few times before it connected. A deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. Hello? For a moment, I couldn't speak. I was too overwhelmed by the reality of what I was doing. This was the man who had haunted my mother's life for years, the man who had abandoned us and left her to raise me on her own. But he was also my father, and that was something I couldn't ignore. It's Mia, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he said, I've been waiting for this call. When I decided to meet my father, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he be the villain my mother had warned me about? Or would he be different, remorseful, even apologetic for the years he had spent away from me? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was terrifying. We agreed to meet in a neutral place, a cafe on the outskirts of town. I chose the location because it felt safer, far enough from home that it didn't feel like he was intruding on my life. But as I sat at the small table, waiting for him to arrive, my nerves were shot. My hands were trembling, and I could barely keep still. When he walked in, I knew it was him immediately. There was something about the way he carried himself, tall, with a presence that seemed to command attention. His hair was streaked with gray, and there were deep lines etched into his face. But despite the age, there was a familiarity in his features, something that reminded me of my own reflection. He approached the table, and I stood up, my heart pounding. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of years of separation hanging between us. Mia, he said, his voice calm but serious. You look just like your mother. I didn't know how to respond to that. The comparison felt strange, as if he had been watching from afar, knowing us but never truly being a part of our lives. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't know how to start. My mind was racing with questions, but my throat felt tight, as if the words were stuck. I'm sorry, he said finally, breaking the silence. I know you must hate me for staying away all these years. I don't know if I hate you, I admitted, my voice trembling. But I don't know what to think. He nodded, as if he understood. Your mother told you about me, didn't she? About the things I was involved in. She told me enough, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She said you were dangerous. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, maybe. I was dangerous, Mia. I won't lie to you. When your mother left me, I wasn't in a good place. I was involved with people I shouldn't have been, doing things I'm not proud of. But I've changed. I'm not that man anymore. I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't sure if I could. How could I trust a man who had abandoned me and my mother? A man who had been lurking in the shadows of my life without me even knowing? Why didn't you come back sooner? I asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't you try to be part of my life? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. I wanted to. I thought about it every day. But your mother made it clear that she didn't want me around, and I respected that. I thought it was better for you, better for both of you, if I stayed away. I stared at him, my mind racing. But you didn't stay away, did you? You watched us. You were there, even if we didn't know it. I couldn't help it, he admitted, his voice soft. You're my daughter, Mia. I needed to know you were safe. I know it wasn't right, but I couldn't let go. I didn't know what to say. Part of me understood his reasoning, but another part of me felt violated by the idea that he had been watching from a distance, never revealing himself. I don't know if I can trust you, I said finally, my voice cracking. He nodded, his expression somber. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want you to know that I'm here, if you ever want to get to know me. If you ever want to understand where you come from. I left the cafe feeling more confused than ever. Meeting him hadn't given me the closure I had hoped for. Instead, it had opened up more questions, more doubts about everything I thought I knew. It's been a few months since I met my father, and I'm still trying to make sense of everything. I haven't decided if I want to have a relationship with him. Part of me wants to understand who he is now, to fill in the missing pieces of my past. But another part of me is scared of what I might discover, scared of reopening old wounds that have never fully healed. Mom and I have had a lot of difficult conversations since then. There's still tension between us, but we're working through it. I understand now why she kept the truth from me, why she felt the need to protect me. But there's also a part of me that wishes she had trusted me enough to tell me sooner. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever have a real relationship with my father, or if I'll be able to fully forgive my mother for keeping this from me. But I do know that I'm not going to let the past define me. I'm going to move forward, one step at a time, and figure out what's best for me. Life is messy, and family is even messier. But we all have to find our own way through it. And that's what I'm trying to do, figure out who I am, who my parents are, and where I want to go from here.